how much time we have. But I think it's very fun and very educational video. Have you guys heard the book, The Freakonomics? Have you read it? No. Yes? No? Okay. So this video is given by one of the authors, Stephen Levitt, who is a Chicago economist, and he is a wonderful storyteller. Okay, and so basically his research focused on some weird topics such as prostitution and drugs and the crime. So he focused on this kind of topic. So and the video I'm going to show you actually, and he brings about his research and area expertise, and which is related to the prostitution and crime. So I'm just going to open it up and. Okay. I'm going to take the attendance right now. Alexis? Here. Kayla? Here. Corinne? Here. Samantha? Here. Jacob? Here. Elisa? Elisa? Kathleen? Here. Kaylin? Here. Elizabeth? William? Here. Michaela? What's your name? I think it's you. Last name is Riley. It's not here. All right. Sierra? Kiana? Here. Olivia? Here. Blaine? Here. Carly? Kristen? Anna? Anthony? Jada? Here. Sarah? Here. Okay, good. One person's missing. All right. So the plan today, we're going to discuss the topics in chapter 6, and also I'm going to introduce you some concept in supply and demand, okay, and also the market equilibrium. First, I want to ask you, okay, you have all read the materials, okay, and can anyone use just one sentence to summarize what this chapter 6 is about? One sentence, not less than one sentence, not more than one sentence. Hi, Anthony.
When demand goes up, either supply goes down or the quality goes down.
Okay. Good. Anybody else want to give a try?
Demand is higher for illegal substances rather than something that's like legal.
Okay. Well, think about if there is somebody who have never read these materials, okay, and I want you to give a brief description of what this chapter about to that person, so that person gets main idea from this one sentence. How can you do it? Today we have a visitor here, and she has not read these materials. So how can you use one sentence to inform her of what we'll talk about? It's not easy, right? That's why I'm doing it. First, you have to be very familiar with the material in chapter 6. Second, you have to do some critical thinking. Pick up the key elements from the chapter 6. And third, you have to make the connection among all these key, among these key elements.
Is restricting the illegal drugs and all, is that really for the better or the worse for our country?
That's very good. Sarah?
It's a discussion of how we can enforce the restriction of illegal goods and the effect that enforcement has on our economy.
Very good. Very good. Okay.
I have one, but it's like, I highlighted it from the book because I thought it.
Okay, but don't
Okay.
read it. Use your own words.
Use my own
Paraphrase it.
words?
Yeah.
Government involvement in trying to stop mutually beneficial trades in more cases than not produces negative results.
Okay, good. Good try. Others? One sentence. Now you gotta pick and choose. Remember the opportunity cost, right? There's so many materials in this chapter. You gotta pick the key thing. Who else wanted to try?
Can it be phrased in a question?
Sure, anything.
Okay, well mine was, is government, what's the word? Government, I'm trying to think of the word, the government involvement and the regulation, distribution, and that kind of thing in these substances and that kind of thing and their laws, are they for the better or are they worse for the economy and people's moral values?
Okay, good try. Others? You want to give it a try? No? Why not?
Reducing the consumption of illegal drugs or illegal goods can punish the illegal producers of that good.
Punish the illegal producer of the goods. Okay? Okay, anything else? Okay, so it's my turn. Now I'm going to tell you what I think the chapter 6 is about. Chapter 6 talks about the market for illegal goods and services. Not just goods, services. Prostitution is a service. So talk about the market for illegal goods and services and how the government intervention affect the markets. One sentence. It talks about the market for illegal goods and services and how government intervention affect this market. So that's what basically this chapter is about. Because there are 3 goods and services mentioned in this chapter, right? Okay. And the common feature among them is they're all illegal. Okay. And also, and there's another common feature in these 3 different markets. The government intervenes, right? Government has this prohibition. Then we talk about the impact of this policy and how effective it is. Okay. So basically, and this chapter, and if you take a principle microeconomics, this chapter is about supply and demand, okay, and how the supply and demand affected by certain policy. Okay. Now I'm going to ask you another question. So again, one sentence, whole sentence, okay, complete sentence. So what did you find from reading the material? Just one. I mean, you probably discover a lot of things from the reading. Just pick one. What did you learn from reading? One sentence.
When the government intervened, it went either one extreme to the other. It's like when they were talking about how like when the prostitution and all that good stuff, when certain areas when they just started regulating it instead of completely banning it, it's like it was like if they were more better off, but at the same time over here on the other end of the totem pole, where they completely illegal, it's like crime went up and all this other stuff went up, and it seemed like it was just a big spiraling thing of chaos.
What you said very good, but how many sentences there? One sentence.
What's it?
Just one sentence. This actually train you how to think, how to write, how to speak.
The amount of legal activity.
So I learned. Okay.
What I learned is that the amount of illegal services and goods is what keeps law enforcement going and funds them.
Okay, good. That's gonna be a sentence. Good.
I learned that through human nature, whenever things are outlawed and banned, we want them more than if they're just regulated.
Okay, very good.
I learned that especially like pertaining to like illegal services, not necessarily goods, government intervention may not always be the best solution.
Good.
I learned that when there's better chance when the drug is illegal that the drug's like quantity and like value won't be as good because they're trying to hide it better.
Okay. Okay. Good. Still one sentence. Okay. Try to make a sentence shorter. Okay.
I learned that restricting drugs only grows the black market for it even more.
Okay. Good.
I learned that the higher the price of the illegal goods and services, the lower the amount is consumed.
Okay.
I learned that once a drug or something is made illegal, that people start using the like more intense illegal drugs.
Okay. Good.
I learned that government intervention affects the demand for an illegal product or service in some way.
Okay. How about you? Okay. You want to give it a try?
I learned that when the government seeks to prevent these illegal things going on, that it either looks at the consumer or the producer, but most times it goes after the producer.
Okay, good. Very good. All right.
What I learned is that when something's illegal, people are going to do it anyway, so you might as well allow the economy to benefit from people doing this stuff by charging a tax on alcohol or something like that.
Good. I think you guys did a wonderful job. Try to shorten the sentence. Okay? There's a purpose I'm doing this. Train you think, train you how to speak, and train how you write, Because when you write and speak, and give a formal presentation, you have to be very concise. Okay? Okay, good. But before I introduce you the model of supply and demand, and also introduce you some fundamentals in this chapter, but I want to ask you a few more questions here, okay? And the first question, you may think a little bit odd question, is why criminals become the criminals? Why they choose dealing drug as their profession? Okay. I'm gonna start here.
I would say mostly just because there's a demand for it.
There's demand for it, okay? So that's one possible reason.
It's profitable.
It's profitable.
I feel like some people just need to have an adventurous life and they just figure doing that will make them money and they won't have to be sitting in an office doing it, and they like to live on like the edge.
Okay. And somebody else, what's their reason? Claim?
The marginal benefit could be tremendous if they don't get caught.
Okay, good. Somebody else was missing that?
Sometimes it's out of necessity, especially with drug dealers and that kind of thing. They need the money.
Okay. I watched the TV show Breaking Bad.
I was trying to reference that, but I didn't know
Yeah,
it would take me
that's
seriously.
Oh, I think that's awesome example, actually, for this material we're going to talk about. and I love the show. I think that's probably one of the best TV shows ever made. Okay? But thinking, using that example, come back to this question here. Why that Walter White, right? That's his name, right? Became the criminal. There's two reasons, right? And he got cancer, and he want to help his family. Okay, that's one objective, answer. But there is another, actually, reason underneath. He is a quite chemist, right? He's quite chemist, and also actually he had the chops to be a criminal. I mean, he discovered that later, but he did. Okay, so what does this tell you? Why criminals become criminals?
Some criminals become criminals to support their own habits. Like a drug dealer is going to be able to supply himself with more drugs since he's selling. So kind of like, yeah, like you keep your supplies and you have more money to get your own drugs. So.
Some criminals just can't, like, they grow up in certain areas and they just can't get out of it. So that's their lifestyle and they can't figure out a way to fix it.
But, thinking about the example of Breaking Bad, can anybody become Walter White?
Yes.
Can anybody become Walter White?
If you're smart.
If you're smart enough. That's the point, if you're smart enough. So what I think, there's another reason underneath the surface is this is actually, it's not a very simple field in become, doing a crime, become criminal. It requires certain expertise, certain expertise in this particular field. And yes, the family background and the pressure from the society, all this, the reason externally contribute to the fact that he became a criminal. But there's another reason is this person must have interest or has some skills in this field, has certain expertise fits very well in this particular field. And I think Breaking Bad, in this story, Walter White actually, he found his niche in this field. He was brilliant chemist. But the only thing, he did with it was a teacher in high school. He could not capitalize his expertise. But once he discovered this field, and his ego went up. Why? Because he found his niche. So that is actually one of the reasons underneath this, and this fact. I'm not saying, if somebody has this expertise, they should into this field. That's not what we're talking about, okay? But I'm sorry, there is this, kind of hidden reason why some criminals become criminals, because they just have this job, have this skill to be really good at it, okay? Okay, so next I'm going to introduce you some concept in supply and demand. Okay, you probably have learned that. Have you guys learned supply demand model before? Have you learned it? Okay, so if you have learned it, I'm going to ask you a few questions. Okay, first we're going to talk about the demand. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the law of demand. What is law of demand? What is law of demand? You guys read the book, mentioned the law. What is the law of demand?
The law of demand states that if the demand goes higher, that if the prices go higher, the demand goes down.
That's right. If price higher, consumer demand less. Okay. If price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Okay. And economists like to put it in a graph. Okay. In this graph here, vertical axis represents the price, market price of the good. Horizontal axis represents the quantity. Okay. And since the law of demand said when the price goes up, quantity goes down. So what do you think the demand curve look like? Has a negative slope or positive slope?
Negative.
So basically, the law of demand describes the relationship between the market price and the quantity demanded. So they say, okay, there is an impact on the quantity demanded from the price. But as you know, as you read the chapter, the price is not the only thing that affects the quantity demanded, right? There are many other things, prohibition, okay? And substitution of the other goods, availability of other kind of drugs, right? Oh, there's many factors that actually affect the quantity demanded. But in this curve here, you don't see it, right? Okay, so one thing, what I want to introduce you today is, when we look at this demand curve, there is an underlying assumption. The underlying assumption says that all other factors are held constant. So all the rest of the factors that may affect the quantity demanded now are held constant. Okay, for example, the first thing may affect the demand is income. Right? If you don't have the money, you cannot consume, right? So that's the very first factor. And that has to be held constant when you draw the demand curve, when we use the law of demand to describe things. Because if income changes, this relationship described by the law of demand is going to be different. Okay. So let me ask you this. When the income goes up, what do you think quantity demanded is going to happen? It's going to go up. It's going to go up or go down? All remain constant. Let's use the goods of alcohol. Okay? When I was a student, I did not have much money. Okay? Now I have much more than I had before. But my consumption in alcohol did not increase. Okay? Another example. Still using me. When I was a student, I shopped in TJ Maxx a lot. Okay? I spent a lot of money in that store. Okay, but now I seldom go to that store. I like to shop in bulk now. My consumption in TJ Maxx has decreased since I got the job. So what does my story tell you?
Means that you have more money to spend on nicer, more quality clothes.
So.
Or more designer.
So now, come back to this question. When the income increases, what's going to happen to quantity demand?
It's going to go up.
Is it going to stay constant or decrease?
It's going to go up. It's going to stay constant. Somebody says it's going to decrease.
Could do.
So what is the answer?
You can't tell.
It depends on what it is.
It depends.
Right.
It depends on what kind of goods we talk about. And also depends on how elastic. Later on we will encounter this concept, elasticity. Okay. Not only depends on what the goods we talk about, also depends on how elastic the demand of this good is. What the meaning of elasticity? Elasticity means how quantity demanded respond to the change of price. For some people, and when the gas price goes up, they're still going to drive. They're not going to decrease their driving much. Okay, but for some people, they might start carpooling, right? So for the people who, not going to decrease the, gas consumption, not going to decrease the driving, they will have inelastic demand. Okay. So the first factor, income. How the income affects the demand? It depends. There are two kinds of goods that we usually talk about. The first one is normal goods. For the normal goods are the goods that when the income goes up, you consume more. Okay? You guys with me here? When the income goes up, your consumption is up. And we call those kind of goods a normal goods. The second category of goods that we talk about, I call it crap. Actually, there's economic term, it's inferior goods. So inferior goods are goods that when you have more money, actually you consume less. Okay, the example I gave to you, that TJ Maxx, those goods to me were inferior goods because when I had more money, I spent less money in TJ Maxx. So this is the very first factor that's going to affect the demand, in addition to the price. Okay. If this criminal has a lot of money and he has interest, in the alcohol drug, and he probably going to consume more. All right, so this is the first factor. The second factor that affects the demand is what we call the price of related goods. Price of related goods. What is the price of related goods? Give you this example. Coke and Pepsi. To me, I'm indifferent. I mean, for some of you, probably you prefer one than the other, right? I'm indifferent between these two products. I saw Pepsi now is on sale. So I'm going to decrease the consumption in Coke. So Pepsi's price affects the demand because these two goods are related. And in this context, actually they are substitutes, right? Okay. So one category of related goods are substitutes. And there is another category of goods, related goods. The example would be Mac computer and software that go with Mac. Let's say, the software that go with Mac, the price of them went up. How that's going to affect the consumption for Mac computer? It's going to go down. Okay? Why? You have to consume both goods together. Okay? If one good's price goes up, and that's going to affect your consumption of the other good. So, and in this context, the relationship of these two goods are what? Complements. Okay. And later, actually, in this chapter, there are two goods that are considered substitute for criminals. Okay, I'm going to ask you later. Okay. What else? What else can you think of that might affect quantity demanded? In addition to the income, price of related goods. What else?
Brand loyalty.
Loyalty. Okay, good. Preference. Consumer's preference. The example I gave you for the alcohol. I don't have interest in it. That's why, my change of income is not going to affect my consumption of alcohol at all. Right? So preference. Okay? And people's preference change over time. Preference and expectations. Okay? Halloween is coming. Okay? Or Thanksgiving is coming. You think there may be a big sale on the camera you really love to buy. So you're not going to spend money right now, you're going to wait until then to buy it. So if you expect price going to go down later on, your consumption, your demand of that good is going to decrease at present time. Okay, so preferences and expectation. Okay. What else? Quality. Okay? Quality is also related to preference. If the quality is better, I prefer this. Right? Preference.
Competition?
Competition. That's a good factor. Do you think the competition are going to affect demand directly, or is going to affect the supply directly? So when we talk about the factors here, we kind of isolate the demand from the supply. We say just what has a factor that has a direct impact on the demand. So I would say competition might have impact on the supply.
Whether it's a necessity or not.
Whether necessity or not. Very good. Okay. Necessity. Necessity. Right? Did I pronounce it right? And I'm not going to list all the factors. There are many more factors. Probably millions, billions factor effect that's going to affect the quantity demand. Okay, but the reason I list all this here is to let you know that price, market price, is not the only component that impact the quantity demanded. There are many more other factors. And when you draw this demand curve, you have to hold all these factors constant. Because when any one of these factors change, this demand is going to shift. Okay? When the demand is going to shift, and it's going to affect market equilibrium. Okay? So this is demand side. Just a brief review of what demand is about. Okay, so now let's talk about supply. There's nothing says law of supply, but you should know that when market price goes up, quantity supplied goes up or goes down. When the market price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. If you can sell this good at a higher price, of course you want to produce more, sell more. Okay? So that's the relationship. And if we put another graph, supply has this shape, right? It's a positive relationship. Okay. So again, we're going to briefly talk about what are the factors that affect the supply curve. Again, in this graph here, there's no other factor, just price and quantity demand. But you know there are many other factors that's going to affect the quantity supplied. Okay? So what do you think the number one factor that's going to affect the supply curve, in addition to the price? In addition to the price. And in this chapter, we talk about the prohibition, right? What is that? What does prohibition do to the producer or supplier of illegal goods?
It makes them busier because people want more from them.
Increases the demand.
Increase the risk? That's what you said?
I said increase the demand, like what you were saying.
Increase the demand. Okay, Sarah.
Increase the cost for the supplier.
Increase the cost of providing the goods. So the number one factor that's going to affect the supply, we call it input price. Input price is used because here we're talking about good. But here, this input price can be treated as any kind of cost that's contributed to the production or the supplying of the goods. Okay? So if it costs you more to produce, if it costs you more to provide this service, then input price goes up. When the input price goes up, what's happened to the supply? Goes down. It's going to go down. So when it goes down, it's shift to the left or shift to the right? Shift to the left. Good.
Yeah.
Okay? Remember, if it goes down, it shifts to the left. Okay. What else? Number one factor is input price. What other factors? Somebody earlier mentioned the competition, right? So what if there's a lot of competition in the market? What does it imply? There are a lot of similar goods, right? There are a lot of substitutes. Okay? So if there are a lot of substitutes in the market, and if price of those substitutes change, that's going to impact our supply of this particular good, right? So again, the price of related goods. This related good come from competition. Others? You think of other factors?
Where the materials or the contents to produce something, if the like basics ingredients, if they increase those prices, then you would have to buy those, which would increase your price.
Input price.
Okay.
Right. You're talking about ingredients that's used to produce, right?
Adding on to that thought, if the resource, a particular resource goes away.
Mm-hmm. If it goes away, then the substitute should arise as the particular input, then that substitute's price will play a role in this market, right? Okay. What else? What do you think about technology? Would that play a role?
Yes.
When there's a better technology, what do you think supply? Remember in that example, Breaking Bad, later on, at first, Walter White make this drug in a trailer, right? How much, was he able to make? Not much, right? But later on, he had a big sophisticated plant to do it. Okay, so one of the factors that affect the supply is technology. And this is a very important factor. When there is better technology, supply will go up. When supply is up, supply shift to the right or left? Right. Supply shift to the right. Okay, good. Okay. Again, there are many other factors that affect the supply. Okay, we're not going to list it all. Okay. So this is the supply and demand. Okay, so just now when we talk about these two sides, we isolate it. We just look at the factor that has a direct impact on either supply or the demand. But when you go to the grocery store, you look at the price for the apple is $2 per pound, or you look at milk is $3 per bottle. That price has both supply and demand in it. How was that price determined? You go to the movie theater, it's $7 for student. It's $9 for the adults. How was that price determined?
The equilibrium.
It's determined by both supply and demand. So if we put the supply and demand together, then you see this cross point. We're not going to go into detail because this is not economic class, but I just want to use this graph to briefly tell you. And was this point here, what we call it, is equilibrium point. And this one, this price here, we call the market clearing price. Market clearing price. Why we call the market clearing price? Because at that price, the people who want to buy this good will find the good for sure. And the people who want to sell this good at price is able to find a buyer. So market is clear. Everybody's happy. Everybody's content. And it's equilibrium because it's a temporary stable situation. It's temporary stable. So the price you saw in the market, the $3 per bottle of milk is this. It is equilibrium price, and it's going to change if either supply or demand is going to shift. Okay. So I want you to keep this concept in mind later on when we discuss those questions. So any questions here? Okay. It's pretty straightforward, right? Okay. Another thing I want to mention here is, okay, so now we know what is supply-demand model, what is market equilibrium point. Okay. And next, what we want to talk about is efficient market. Because this is also related to what we're going to talk about, efficiency. We see this word a lot, from TV, by reading the newspaper. Sometimes you would use this word, oh, this person is efficient, that person is not. So what do you understand? What's your understanding about this word, efficient market?
Something that get things done on time and at a good pace.
Good pace, yes, sometimes that's how we use this word to describe the person, right? Okay, but if we use in market, efficient market, what do we mean?
Productive and progressive. Productive and progressive.
Productive.
Being able to use the least amount of resources, like to pay.
To produce the most.
Right.
That's it. Efficient market is market when we're able to use the least amount of resources to produce the most. And it's also market where the profit margin cannot be maintained for a very long period of time. I'm going to say that again. Okay. Efficient market is a market where the profit margin cannot be maintained by any firm, by any producer for a very long period of time. Okay. Efficient market is a market where the profit margin for any firm or provider cannot be maintained for a very long period of time. If any firm is able to maintain that positive profit margin for a longer period of time, then we say this market is not efficient. Okay. And think about the company, Apple company. When they first started the very first product, in the last 20 years, iPod, right? I remember, and they were the first one who has this kind of design and does this kind of thing, right? Okay. And they made a lot of money. I remember the iPod was sold at $400 then. Okay. But what happened later on? You guys remember? Maybe you're too young, I think. Later on, some other electronic companies start entering into this market, making similar products. They're making a lot of different kind of MP3 player. Basically, they do the same thing. Different design, but they do the same thing. Okay? If a market is efficient, and competitors should be able to come in very soon. If there is a barrier for the other competitor to come in, then we say this market is not efficient. Then the existing firm, is able to maintain profit margin for a longer period of time. Okay? Okay, so why we want to talk about the efficient market? Because here we talk about the market for the illegal goods, there's also a concept of efficiency and inefficiency here. Okay, so just now we talk about barrier to entry. Okay. So in order to market to be efficient, there must be no barrier to enter. Okay, so that's one of the condition for the efficient market.
So in order for it to be efficient, there's a barrier.
There must be no barrier to enter.
Oh, no barrier.
Yeah, because if there is a barrier to enter, what happens? Then they can maintain the market share, they can maintain the profit margin. Okay. And the second condition for the efficient market is there's no asymmetric information. Well, this means that if we want the market to be efficient, the buyer should know exactly how good this product is. If not, then some transaction may be lost. Okay, and one market with severe asymmetric information component is a used car market. Okay, you go to a car dealer to buy a used car. The car dealer knows exactly how good that car is, but you don't. Okay, and because then we call this situation has asymmetric information component. When there's a symmetric information component, what happened? You will not be willing to pay the price that actually the dealer asked for. Okay, and due to that, there are some transaction will be lost. Okay, so asymmetric information is very, very important in order to have efficient market. Okay, and later on, and in chapter 6, they talk about how the prohibition actually leads to asymmetric information problem. Remember? Okay. So that's the two things I want to mention about for the efficient market. So basically, when you look into this material in this chapter, you're going to think about whether this market is efficient or not, whether the government intervention will make this market more efficient or more inefficient. Okay. Any question here? Okay, so okay. So the rest of time, actually, I want to show you this fun movie. Okay? Okay, I'm just going to show you for 30 minutes. And I want you to take notes. Okay, it is very fun, but I still want to take notes. And for the next class, we're going to discuss the question at the end of this chapter. Right? Okay, keep in mind of what we talk about here. Okay?
Somebody's charging the wrong price for this lecture, because it's just, we could have done a lot of money left on the table if somebody. So looking around, the first thing that comes to mind is somebody's charging the wrong price for this lecture, because it's just, we could have done a lot of money left on the table if somebody would have thought to raise the price. And there also must not be much to do in Princeton tonight. The crowd is certainly a lot bigger than the crowd the first time I came and talked at Princeton. I was in my first year after I graduated from MIT, and I was at the Harvard Society Fellows, and I had never spoken outside of Cambridge. And Howard Rosenthal, who was a professor in political science, asked me if I'd come down and give a talk. And he said, come down the day before, I'm going to set up a whole slate of meetings for you. I know there are so many people who want to meet you in the economics department. It's going to be a wonderful time. So I took the train down the night before, and I stayed at Howard's house. And in the morning he said, well, I had a little trouble with your schedule. It's not as full as I wanted it to be. And I said, oh, that's okay. And he said, I was only able to get one person to talk to you all day. And so that meeting's at about 11:30. Otherwise, you're on your own, enjoy the day in Princeton. So sat alone in a room for 6 hours, and I was nervous and building up this anticipation of my first seminar at an institution away from home. And the one professor, so there's one guy, Ken Rogoff, who's now at Harvard, was very nice to me and talked to me for half an hour, and otherwise I was completely alone. And the time came where I've been in this room now for 6 hours, and Howard came and knocked on the door and said, it's time. And we got up and we went to the seminar room, and we were there a few minutes early, and we were the first two there. And the clock kind of ticked by. It was now 5 minutes after, and it was still just Howard Rosenthal and myself sitting in this room. And then it was 10 minutes after, and finally 15, and we were still alone. I said, listen, Howard, you already read the paper. How about you and I just go get a beer? And he said, no, I'm sure that people are coming. And about 4 people came in at about 20 after, and we started the seminar. And so I was giving my seminar, and then about maybe 15 minutes later, one other guy comes in, and this other guy starts asking these really smart questions, and I'm thinking, who is this guy? Who is this smart guy? And it turned out it's Hank Farber, who was sitting here in the front row, and it actually made the trip very worthwhile because Hank gave me a lot of great ideas on a paper, but the cap on the day was that after the talk, we were walking out, and Howard Rosenthal was talking to, I guess, one other faculty member from political science that showed up. And Howard Rosenthal said to him, this other paper he has is much better than the one he presented today. And that was Howard's appraisal of what had happened in the seminar. And that was my first trip to Princeton. So my second trip to Princeton is when I was on the job market. And I came, and I'm going to spare Orly Ashenfelter sitting here. I'm going to spare Orly from what he did in that talk, which I thought was interesting. But even more interesting was so as soon as we got in the seminar room, someone decided to turn out the lights, which I thought was kind of strange. And immediately, almost everyone in the room went to sleep. I think there was not a person in the room who did not sleep at some point. And all this was fine. But Mike Rothschild, who might even be here today, so Mike Rothschild was a dean of the policy school, and so he was there, and he had brought his dog. I think his dog's name was Rosie, and so Rosie was much more alert than most of the faculty members, and seemed to be enjoying the seminar much more. So Rosie, about maybe half an hour into it, got up and came to the front of the room and began sniffing me. Okay. And so everyone turned to Mike to ask him, why he wasn't doing anything with his dog, and he was sound asleep. And nobody wanted to wake him up. And so I eventually was able to shoo Rosie back to her spot, and the seminar went on. There are, it's funny because many of you probably don't know, but I almost came to Princeton. It was back actually before Ben Bernanke got demoted from head of the department to chairman of the department to chairman of the Fed. Back in those days when Ben, and it's funny because it's one of the few decisions in my life where I've ever been completely indifferent, right? Every major decision I've ever had to make, where to go to college. So my father told me, you can either go to Harvard, I didn't pay for Harvard or the University of Minnesota, and those were only 2 choices. So when I got into Harvard, I went to Harvard. And in my first job, there's never, but it was interesting. I was basically essentially indifferent between Princeton and Chicago, and ended up staying in Chicago essentially because of money. That Chicago offered me more money, and I was told by Bo that I had to mention that so it would help him in his negotiations with future faculty. But it's funny because I have a sort of a sense of regret every time I come back to Princeton. I want their outcomes, or how a crack selling gang works. Economists would be caught dead asking whether the name here, it's kind of you to all come out and the kind of economics I do is not the kind of economics that most economists do. It's asking the ridiculous questions that no self-respecting economist would be caught dead asking, whether the name you give your kid matters for their outcomes, or how a crack selling gang works, or whether real estate agents are ripping you off. It's a set of, the worst one's probably the sumo wrestlers, and right, cheating in pseudo wrestlers, and with teachers, it's the kind of question that, it's not the kind of questions that you dream about writing about when you enter graduate school or when you're growing up. And so how did I come to be this kind of economist? And it wasn't really by choice. They did a survey of academic economists recently. And in this survey, they asked, what is the single most important attribute to succeed as an economist? And so 2% of the economists said a good working knowledge of the economy was the most important thing to be a successful economist, which it says something about our discipline. Almost 70% said proficiency at math was the single most important thing. But my problem is that I've never been accused of being good at math by anyone. And I think the story that best brings this to life is that I recently had my 20-year high school reunion. And I went back, and at my high school reunion, my high school calculus teacher showed up. A guy named Mr. Drexel. He must have been at least 80, because he was at least 60 when he taught me. And I was very surprised to see him at my reunion. And just as a cruel joke, I went up to him and I introduced myself. And I said, I'm Steve Levitt. You taught me calculus 20 years ago. And it was sad because, of course, he looked blankly at me. I could see him trying to think of anything he could recollect about this mediocre student that he had taught 20 years earlier. And finally, I kind of saw this light go off, this light sparkle come into his eye. And he said, wait a second, did you get a 2 on the calculus AP exam? And I said, as a matter of fact, I did. And he said, that's the lowest score that any student I ever taught got. I remember you. And I didn't really do anything to change that in between the time I graduated from high school and the time I went back to get a PhD. I took 1 semester of college calculus. They retested me. So I went to Harvard, and they retest you. They test you before the first semester starts. And I did so badly on the retest that I actually got placed into Calculus 1A at Harvard, the beginning calculus, even though I'd already taken a year. And that was the last math class that I ever took. And so I went through the rest of college. I worked for a few years as a consultant. And then I got this bright idea that I was going to go back and get a PhD in economics. And I was already kind of an economist at heart, and I believed in markets. And my view was the faculty at MIT wouldn't let me into the program, the PhD program, if I didn't have the right preparation to succeed. Okay, and only later, when I was on the other side of the admissions task, did I realize how completely crazy that faith had been, because what people decide, it's just not at all clear what the decisions are to let people in. But I was optimistic, and I showed up at MIT, and that optimism lasted, I don't know, like 10 minutes into my first lecture, as the professor scribbled up on the board these equations that were loaded with D's. Okay, and I remembered enough of calculus to know that a D stood for a derivative. That was good, so I was writing in my notebook. But along the way, I got this really haunting feeling, because when I looked closely at the board, it seemed like there were these 2 different kinds of D's floating around. And I was just writing down D in my notebook, and I thought it was just bad penmanship, and I was just going along. But the more I looked at it, I've always been good at pattern recognition. What I realized with some of these D's, the D's that went straight up and down were in one part of the equation, and the curly ones were always in a different part. And I thought, there might be something here I'm not aware of. And so I turned to the guy next to me, and I said, hey, is there a difference between the curly D and the straight D? And he turned back to me and he said, you are in so much trouble. And he was right. I mean, I was in so much trouble. I did not know what was going on. And I managed to pass my classes mostly because it was too hard to fail people at MIT. It was a lot of trouble to fail people at MIT, and so they let me in. And so I got through the first semester, and I just knew it was a bad situation. And so I went back home to Minneapolis, where I grew up, and I pondered my fate. And I had been a consultant, and being a consultant was very hard work. And I found it very unpleasant work, and I really did not want to have to go back to doing that. Because the obvious thing to do would have been just to quit, just to stop, to drop out of the program. But I talked to my father, and my father told me a story that was intended to hearten me. And this is completely a true story. Pretty much everything I'm going to tell you today is completely true, including this story. And so my father is a doctor. He's a medical researcher. And he said, when I was just getting started in medical research, I was in the same situation you were in. He said, my mentor, a guy named Franz Engelfinger, who ended up being later the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, was my father's mentor when he was doing a fellowship. And he said, Engelfinger pulled me aside one day, and he said, Levitt, you don't have much talent for medical research. And my father kind of shrugged his shoulders. And then this guy, the mentor, went on to say, but there's one area of medicine that's so devoid of research that even some of your limited talents might be able to make a difference. So my father said, well, what area is that? And the guy said, intestinal gas. So my father actually took this advice to heart, and he has devoted his entire career to the study of intestinal gas. He's the world's foremost expert in intestinal gas. And indeed, when I was in high school, GQ did a profile of my father, and the headline was, "The King of Farts." Okay? So my dad's advice was just figure out what it is in economics that everybody is interested in, but all the other researchers are too embarrassed to study it. And that's how you're going to find your way in economics. And I think my father's proud of me. I think that's exactly what I've managed to do, is to sort of replicate his success as the king of farts with Freakonomics. It's the apple did not fall far from the tree. So let me just tell you a couple stories. I want to leave some time for questions as well. A couple of stories of some new research that I'm doing. So one of the perks of writing a book that sells a lot of copies, especially in this case, somebody decided it was a business book, right? So if you've read it, there's nothing about business. The closest thing to business in this book is about how crack gangs look like McDonald's, right? And so, but somehow somebody decided this was a business book. And the greatest thing about writing a best-selling business book is suddenly every CEO thinks that he needs you to come in and give him advice or her advice. And so I get a lot of calls and they say, what do you charge for consulting? And I say, actually I do it for free. Because if you're willing to give me data to write academic papers and the project is interesting, I'll do it for free. And when the CEOs hear my price, they're always very eager to go forward with this deal. And so I've been able to talk with a number of companies. And what's interesting is how ill-suited I am for actually advising companies, because if you think about kind of the way, it took me a while to come out and understand this, about what the difference was between business and academics. In academics, to succeed, you have to be utterly convincing, right? So that a good academic paper basically takes a hypothesis and proves it beyond any reasonable doubt, so that no critic can say that there's some other hypothesis to explain it. Okay, in order to do that, you have to usually bite off little tiny questions that aren't as interesting as the fundamental question you'd really like to answer. Right? So I would really like to know how to cut government corruption, and I end up writing about sumo wrestlers, okay? Because that's what I can be convincing on. But in business, it turns out to totally different. I don't know why it took me so long to recognize it, but in business, basically, what you need is to answer the important questions. And there is no critic there. You only have to answer them halfway well, and if you can even, the only person you either have to convince no one or convince your boss. And so there's a very different standard. Now, what's interesting is, somewhat counterintuitively, I think, as I reflected on it, to be totally convincing, you have to be very simple, right? So something that's complex is almost never convincing to a large group of people. So I can build a complicated model with 20 variables and calibrate it, and it might be right, but there's always someone who said, well, the assumption you made on variable 14 was a bad assumption. And so I've always tried to adopt the simplest possible ways to answer questions that I can. And what's funny is in business, that's not really the view of the world. And so what's interesting, when I go to a big company, is invariably what they'll do is they'll show me some very fancy thing they developed. Like I was at a big electronics retailer, and they brought me in, and they said, we want to show you this. We got this fantastic report done by an outside consultant. They said it cost us $500,000, and we're going to completely revamp our. Now, having studied advertising some, I was deeply suspicious, right? Because there's almost no question harder than figuring out whether advertising works or not, right? Way up and down. I said, let me make another guess. I bet you do a lot of advertising, right? That you should be completely revamping your market. Now, I went to them and told them this, and they weren't pleased. They weren't happy. Okay, and today is one of the most successful electronics retailers in the world, and the incredible thing, and then they looked at it. They did look at it then, and it turned out they found no impact on their sales in Pittsburgh from not having it. Now, what I found so interesting about this is that this lazy MBA who ended up not doing their job and blowing it actually turned out to be much more valuable to this firm than the $500,000 economists who got hired as consultants. They could have learned, they did learn a lot more about their business from a mistake than they learned from this low-quality economic analysis that had been done. Now, what's interesting in the end, they still went ahead and revamped their marketing in spite of this. And so you literally cannot turn on the TV without seeing one of the ads for this company. And my very likely conjecture is that you're going to see this. If I could tell, for a good reason, I'm not telling you the name of this firm, but my guess is they're going to miss their profit numbers by roughly the amount that they're spending, that they've upped their TV budget for this year. Now, I found that the one thing which has been common across all of my experiences with advising businesses is that they have never once taken my advice on anything that I've told them. And I really, honestly, I think the reason is that I've charged the wrong price, right? By giving away my services, I think they feel not at all obligated to listen to what I say, and so they just figure if this guy's giving it away, it can't be any good. And I've had no success whatsoever. And I've had there's one counterexample to this, of where I've actually helped a business person make a lot of money. And I was actually talking to a crowd of investment bankers. This was probably now, must be 6 months ago. And in the Q&A session, someone asked, well, what are you working on now? And so I told them about a project I'm working on, which is a project with this guy, Sudhir Venkatesh, who I did the work on crack gangs. He eventually got too old to hang out with the crack gangs, and he got tired of being shot at, and he got married, and he just decided he wanted to do it. So instead, he hooked up with a bunch of pimps and prostitutes on the south side of Chicago, and convinced them that they let us put our trackers out on the street corner. So out on the street corner with the prostitutes, we put people with clipboards and data sheets, and after the prostitute did a trick, they'd come back and they'd report everything about that trick to our trackers. Now, it's been an interesting, it's not even the point, this is a complete diversion from the point of my story. But anyway, so the project has turned out to be very interesting in a lot of ways. One is that I used to think that being a drug dealer was the worst job in America, but it is completely clear to me now that being a street prostitute is far, far, far worse. Just how bad it is. But there's certain things that I think you learn about the inner city that you just can't imagine just through examples. So one of them is about 7% of all the tricks that the prostitutes do are freebies to the police to avoid arrest. So the police are basically, many of them on-duty police officers are demanding sex from the prostitutes, or else they will arrest them. Another thing, it turns out that the local guy who runs the YMCA, his budget's pretty tight. So he's worked out a deal with the prostitutes where he lets them come in and have sex in the rooms at the YMCA in return for 20% of the wages that they're earning from doing the tricks. So essentially, things that you learn out of this study that I think are going to be ultimately, I think, very, very interesting. Okay, so I explained a little bit of this work, and so later that night, it turned out that one of the investment bankers, this was in Chicago, had made plans to have a date a date with a $300 an hour call girl in downtown Chicago. Okay? And it just turned out that she happened to be reading Freakonomics at the time, and that she did her tricks out of her apartment. And so it was sitting there on the coffee. The book was sitting on the coffee table when this investment banker shows up for his date with this prostitute. And so in order to ingratiate himself with the prostitute, he says, hey, I just saw that guy speak today, and he actually is doing a new study collecting data on prostitution. And so the next day, the prostitute writes me and says, I have a Palm Pilot loaded with data. I wondered if you'd be interested in knowing anything about my client. And so, of course, I said I was very interested, and she said, well, why don't we meet for brunch? Okay, and that was fine, but I had to then convince my wife, and we have 4 young kids, ages 6 and under, and it was going to be on a Saturday, and I'm supposed to be home, and I had to say to her, well, you know, I got to go meet a prostitute downtown. We're going to talk about research projects. And she went along with it, and I went and met this woman. This woman was fascinating. Turns out she had a college degree, and she had worked as a computer programmer at a Fortune 500 company, and was making $80,000 a year, and decided that being a prostitute would be a better job. So she quit her job and became a high-priced call girl, set up her own webpage, and was now making about $250,000 a year, working about 10 hours a week, and couldn't have been happier about the turn that her life had taken. And so, you know, I've been working with all these companies, and one of the big things I've been struggling with companies is trying to figure out what the right price to set is, okay? How do you set prices? And so I was asking her a lot of the same questions I was asking the CEOs about setting price. I was trying to figure out which to charge on the right price. And, you know, you can imagine I wasn't making much headway. So, you know, in order to figure out the right price, you need to figure out what the shape of the demand curve is for the person. So here I am trying to figure, it doesn't sound right, but I was trying to figure out the shape of this prostitute's demand curve, and finally I hit on the right question to ask, and I said to her, she had a dedicated line that people called into, clients called into when they wanted a date, and I said, how do you feel when the phone rings on this dedicated line? And she said, what do you mean? I said, are you happy? And she said, well, she thought about it. She said, no, I guess I'm completely indifferent. And I said, well, if you're indifferent, you're not charging a high enough price, right? Because if you have market power, you want to be charging a markup so that if you could get more business at that price, it should make you happy. So if you're not happy, it means you're not charging a high enough price. And you can imagine this kind of dazed look that came over her face when I was explaining about marginal, markups and marginal cost pricing and stuff. And so, yeah, I didn't see her for a few months, and I teach a class at Chicago on the economics of crime. And one of the last lectures of the semester I give is on economics of prostitution. And it hit me that who better to give the lecture on prostitution than a prostitute? And so I called her up, and she said, no, I don't want to give you a lecture. I've never really done public speaking. I'm not well educated, da-da-da. And the thing I know, though, is that one thing that economists and prostitutes have in common is they will put a price on anything, right? It's just a matter of getting to the right price. And so eventually I convinced her that I'd pay her hourly wage if she would come in and teach my class. Okay, and so she agreed. She came down. Turns out she gives a great lecture, a fantastic lecture. And when I asked my students, it turns out that 1/3 of the students thought that that were there thought that this was the best, the single best lecture they had seen in their entire time at the University of Chicago, which tells you something about the quality of how we what the professors are doing at the university. But along the way we did Q&A, okay, and in this Q&A someone asked her how much she charges, and she says $400 an hour. And I get really mad because I had talked to her just a month or two earlier and she'd been charging $300 an hour. And when we bargained over price, we had never actually mentioned dollars. We just said her hourly wage. And I'm thinking, you just cannot trust prostitutes at all because she's like lying to my students about her wage to get an extra $100 out of me. It's coming out of my own pocket. It's not the kind of thing that you can easily charge through a research budget, $400 for a prostitute to teach you a lecture. And so I'm like fuming. And the next student raises his hand and says, well, how did you decide what to charge? And she turns to me, and she gets this huge smile on her face. And she says, well, I was with Professor Levitt, and he convinced me my services were far more valuable than the $300 I used to charge. And so I raised my price to $400, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me. I put $5,000 in the bank I wouldn't have otherwise, and I'm just so grateful for that I got to meet him. So let me tell you, I'm trying to think what in light of time. Let me tell you.
The expert on this kind of topic, drugs and prostitution, and the rest of the lecture is not related to this topic, but you're welcome to watch it. It's also fun and educational. But there's another video he did on the crime and drugs, and we're going to watch it next class. Then we'll do the